So good morning everyone. I am Jan Andrew Cruz, and before we start with the webinar proper, let us first have a recap of the 8 previous webinar sessions of the Heats Up webinar series. So bakit ba Heats Up yung pangalan ng webinar series ng Project GUHeat? So may two connotations yung term na Heats Up. So first, heat plus up, or in other words, increase in temperature. Since yung Project GUHeat, ang focus namin ay yung alarming increase in surface and air temperatures within urban areas compared to its neighboring rural regions. So, and yung second connotation ay heads up. Heats up, sounds like heads up. Pag sinabi nating heads up, we are alarming someone or calling the attention of someone. So yun yung goal ng Heats Up webinar series, to call the attention of the public and to raise awareness about the urban heat island phenomenon that we are experiencing in highly urbanized and rapidly urbanizing cities in the Philippines. The webinar series consists of 9 sessions from July 17 to August 14, 2020. Yung first session, yung national webinar, ang aim niya was to reintroduce the scope and objectives of Project GUHeat. Yung next 7 sessions are local webinars wherein we presented site-specific UHI studies, output maps, and policy recommendations sa 7 project sites ng GUHeat. And lastly, yung event today, yung closing webinar, ang aim niya is to summarize the project accomplishments, discuss potential applications of GUHeat workflows and studies, launch the GUHeat website, GUHeat engine, mobile application, and ebook, and lastly, formally close the project. In case you missed some of the webinars, let us have a run-through of the 8 sessions. So the first one, the national webinar, we had 315 Zoom attendees and 121 Facebook Live viewers. So yung topics sa national webinar included an introduction to Project GUHeat, a presentation on the urban heat islands in the Philippine context, and 3 presentations discussing different methodologies such as a methodology on predicting LST using OLS, ordinary least squares and regression training models, creating a high-resolution LST map using machine learning, and using mesoscale model, specifically WRF, to map UHI over a regional area such as NCR. So during the webinar, Dr. Enrico Cipallit, the Executive Director of DOSTP Assured, gave the opening message. One of the highlights of this webinar was the presentation of the nationwide LST map in 2015, and ginamit din namin yung map to show the top 15 cities and municipalities with the highest annual average LST. Sa local webinars, meron tayong 3 common presentations. Meron tayong presentation discussing the basics of UHI, its evidences, causes, and effects. Meron din tayong presentation discussing the Project GUHeat's proposed UHI mitigation strategies to improve the thermal environment of each city. And lastly, meron tayong presentation about GUHeat products for UHI mapping and monitoring. So, pinasent namin yung output maps, QGIS plugin, GUHeat engine, and EnviMet software. In addition to the GUHeat speakers, we have also invited resource speakers from each city. So sa Iloilo City webinar, we have invited Mr. Jose Ronnie Peñalosa, the City Planning and Development Coordinator of Iloilo City LGU, who discussed how to create more urban cooling islands in Iloilo City to alleviate urban heat. So one of the highlights of this webinar was the presentation of the diurnal cooling effect of Iloilo River and adjacent vegetation on its surrounding commercial and residential areas. Sa Session 3 Baguio City webinar, we have invited Ms. Antoinette Anaban from Baguio CPDO to discuss the local government's initiatives in addressing urban heat in Baguio City. We're also fortunate dahil naka-attend and nakapagbigay ng feedback and closing message si Mayor Benjamin Magalong. So one of the highlights of Baguio City webinar was the microclimate simulation along Session Road wherein pinakita namin yung effect sa air temperature ng removal ng pine trees and addition ng replacement ng buildings on Session Road. So sa Session 4, Davao City webinar, Dr. Anthony C. Sales, the Regional Director of DOST Region 11, provided the opening message. In addition to the GUHeat speakers, we have also invited 3 resource speakers. So Engineer Ivan Cortez from CPDO discussed sustainable heat-related strategies in Davao City's Comprehensive Land Use Plan 2019 to 2028. Ms. Chinky Pelino Golye, the Executive Director of the Interfacing Development Interventions for Sustainability, proposed policy recommendations on mitigating UHI effect. And Architect Ryan Songkawayon from UP Mindanao presented the crucial role of architects, engineers, and environmental planners in improving the urban greenery situation in Davao City. So, one of the highlights of Davao City webinar was the presentation of a study wherein we have shown na may strong positive relationship ang LST and electricity consumption in different land uses, sa commercial, industrial, and residential land uses. So Session 5, Quezon City webinar, we have invited landscape architect Irene Morales from the Quezon City Parks Department to give details on the Quezon City Urban Greening Plan. Nag-provide din ng feedback si Architect Pedro Rodriguez from City Planning and Development Office regarding the outputs of Project GUHeat. So one of the highlights of the Quezon City webinar was the presentation of the cooling effect of green buildings on the thermal environment of Timog Avenue and Tomas Morato Avenue. So Session 6, Mandaue webinar, Mandaue City webinar, we have invited 4 resource speakers in addition to the GUHeat speakers. So Engineer Crystal Common from the Office of the Building Official gave details on the Green Building Code of Mandaue City. Attorney Christy Marie Alga from CPDO discussed the local public transport route plan of Mandaue City. Architect Charlene Cañete from CPDO presented the Mandaue City Bike Lane, and Engineer Versal Martel from Senro discussed the air quality in Mandaue City. So one of the highlights of the webinar was the detection and mapping of LST hotspot and cold spots in Mandaue City using different satellite-derived indices. So Session 7, Cebu City webinar, one of the highlights was the study showing the seasonal variation of LST in global horizontal regions in Cebu City. So napakita yung variation ng UHI in the hot dry season in January, hot dry season in April, and wet season in August. Session 8, lastly, sa Session 8, Zamboanga City webinar, we have invited landscape architect Riza May Santa Teresa Basing, the Assistant City General Services Officer of Zamboanga City, to present Zamboanga City's initiatives in addressing urban heat gain. So, one of the highlights of the Zamboanga City webinar was its study on the spatiotemporal variation of LST and per capita water consumption in the city. So in summary, sa 8 webinar sessions na to, we had 11 keynote speakers and 27 presentation speakers. So combination siya ng GUHeat speakers and resource speakers from LGU, NGO, and academe. So overall, we had 605 unique Zoom attendees from 488 institutions all over the Philippines. Out of the 605 attendees, 193 were from the academic field. So we had senior high school and college students, teachers, professors, and researchers. We also had 165 participants from the local government offices. Hindi lang siya from our partner LGUs, but from different municipalities and cities in the Philippines. We also had 119 participants from national government agencies. So marami tayong attendees from DHSUD, DNR, DSWD, FIVOX, PAG-ASA, Ecosystems and Research Development Bureau, etc. In addition, we also had 34 attendees from private companies, 27 from NGOs, and 67 na not specified sa registration. So that's the end of my presentation. So I hope today sa closing webinar, marami pa tayong matutunan. So meron tayong 5 remaining presentations, Project GUHeat accomplishments, collaboration experience, GUHeat application on air quality assessment, urban planning and development, and yung launching ng mobile app, GUHeat website, GUHeat engine, and ebook. That's the end of my presentation. Thank you very much po.